I admit to you that an Easter story felt discongruous to me this week with the reality of where we are. Some days, it feels hard to preach or even to see the new life of the resurrection. But seeing Mary Magdalene's story through the words of the psalm, I began to feel a deep resonance with the saint we celebrate today. As the deer longs for the water brooks, so longs my soul for you, O God. Let us begin where Mary began, in the dark. Now that we know the end of the story, it can be tempting to skip to the gardener, to Jesus calling her name, to her announcement about seeing the Lord. But that's not where Mary started. I imagine that she was both exhausted and could not sleep. Finally, I think she just couldn't take lying there anymore, and she gets up. It is so early in the morning that it is still dark as she begins to make her way down the dusty paths. Her longing for this Jesus who has been crucified compels her to the tomb, leads her to abide even in a place of death and despair, if it means she might draw nearer to God. So longs my soul for you, O God. I know this longing. I too long for the body of Christ, revealed in the gathered community, broken and shared in the Eucharistic meal. I too am both exhausted and restless. Despair seems to stretch out before us as if the morning might never dawn. Here again the psalmist, my tears have been my food day and night, while all day long they say to me, where now is your God? Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, weeping, looking for Jesus. Not only had others fled or deserted this Messiah, but now even she does not know who has taken away her Lord or where they have laid him. Whether a taunt, as in the psalm, or a genuine unknowing, this is a painful question. Where now is your God? Continues to be asked in every age, in times of distress and hopelessness, when faithful people pray and seek God and find only emptiness. This unsettling question echoes. The psalmist was writing a song of lament, a thoroughly ancient prayer form that sometimes gets neglected in our contemporary depictions of what conversation with God ought to look like. Lament is more than mere sadness, deeper than venting, more heart-wrenching than frustration. It is, as the psalm says, a pouring out of the soul to God. These prayers are often characterized by a cry of, "How long, O Lord, how long?" The Hebrew Scriptures have many examples of both individual and communal lament, especially in times of exile, when, as a whole people, they could not be in the place where they had come to know God, where they had encountered God, where God had spoken with them. They wondered whether the presence of God would remain with them apart from their sacred spaces. And yet, even with the heaviness and disquiet of the soul, these laments were indeed poured out to God. They rely on an underlying trust that God will hear, that even when they could not see any way forward, that God would make a way, that even when they felt utterly abandoned and alone, God was somehow in their midst. This is why the psalmist can say to the soul, "Put your trust in God, for I will yet give thanks to the Holy One." Why Mary, not understanding anything that was happening, can respond, "Tell me where you have laid him," still seeking Christ, still trusting that there will yet be a way to come close to God. On this side of the story, we know that the tomb is empty, not because God is absent, but because God is present. When Jesus calls Mary's name, when Mary recognizes Jesus and cries, "Rabboni," we can see the fulfillment of the psalm. She has indeed encountered the one who is the help of my countenance and my God. But what about us? We might not be at the end of the psalm yet. A fresh wave of despair seems to be washing over many people. Back in March, we heard that the pandemic would be better, that our isolation would be reduced in August. Now we learned that many schools will not reopen their buildings, that our church community will not be regathering in person yet, that we still cannot visit cherished loved ones. How long, O Lord? How long? Many of us who have been holding on, who have held back depression or hopelessness, now find ourselves in a place of longing, tears, or despair. And that is okay. That is a faithful place to begin. With Mary Magdalene, we stumble through faithful darkness, waiting in the shadows that are sometimes characterized as being devoid of God's presence, but are in fact the very places where God is already doing something new, unseen. We might be alone. We might not understand the message of the angels. We might not know where to look for Christ, might not even recognize when God is standing right next to us. But God showed up into all of that when Mary followed the longing of her soul. We know what Mary could only yearn to believe, that God brings new life out of death, hope from anguish. This does not diminish the reality of our pain and loss. That is where lament comes in the place between our trust and our tears, between the emptiness of our spirit and the emptiness of the tomb. The longing is prayer. The pouring out of our soul, an offering. Our tears, our doubts, a holy conversation. If your spirit is athirst for God, the living God, if you don't exactly know where now is the presence of Christ, you are in the company of the saints. as we cry, "How long?" As we pour out our souls, let us yet put our trust in the God of resurrection.